Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about Ronbus's brand new 16mm R2 Nova Gen 3 paddle that literally just got released. Ronbus has always made some really solid paddles in the past, and I gotta say this is no exception, so make sure to stick around. Please consider subscribing if you enjoy, and now let's jump into things. Alright, so starting things off, this is an $180 wide body carbon fiber thermoformed paddle. It has a paddle length of 16 inches, a width of 8 inches, a grip length of 5.5 inches, and a swing weight of only 106 with a twist weight of 6.59. I can tell you right now, because of that light swing weight, this thing is super easy to maneuver, but we'll get into that in a bit. Additionally, they've also added in their own patent pending edge grid technology to this, where they claim that it makes the paddle even more powerful than the Gen 2 paddles while maintaining control for the soft game. I'm not gonna lie, I don't completely understand it all, but it is there. Anyways, now let's jump into the gameplay, starting with power. So being a wide body paddle, power is definitely not the selling point of the R2 Nova. That said, the power you can generate with this still isn't terrible. Maybe that's thanks to their edge grid technology. In other words, you can still hit some really decent drives as well and get a lot of snapping power on volleys, rolls, and overheads. All that said though, it's still not going to match up to a gearbox or some of the harder hitting paddles out there. But again, it's still not terrible for power, and for power alone, I would give it a 7 out of 10. All right, now let's talk a little bit about the pop on this paddle. So the pop on the other hand is just slightly worse. I feel like it was okay, but spoilers, this paddle is just a very soft paddle in general. So again, it's just not the paddle's strong suit. It just felt like sometimes on blocks especially, the ball seemed to go nowhere after it made contact with it. There were even a few times where I felt like I was doing a full-on swing and the ball would still go nowhere. With all that said, you can still generate a lot of offensive pop and power yourself pretty easily, since again, it is just such a whippy paddle, which is actually really nice and kind of makes up for it. Additionally, I think it's worth mentioning that even though this paddle doesn't have a ton of pop on it, it's still so good for hands battles. The combination between the lightweight and wide body just makes everything a little bit more forgiving and really gives you a bit of an extra edge for blocks and counters. Still, for pop alone, I would give this a 6.5 out of 10. All right, now let's jump into the part of the paddle that really shines and the sole reason that you should really consider getting this paddle in the first place, and that would be control. So I have to admit, this is probably one of the best paddles I've used so far when it comes to the control and soft game. To start, this paddle is ridiculously soft. If you've never used a Ronbus paddle before, one of the things you should know about them is they're just very known to have soft paddles in general, and this R2 Nova is even more so thanks to the wide body. This extremely soft and plush feeling that you get when using this paddle made the entire control game feel just that much better. Third shot drops felt so good right out of the box and even weeks later, and it definitely wasn't one of those paddles that you need to break in, as this had one of the easiest transition periods I've had out of any of the paddles that I've used so far. Plus, for the actual drops themselves, everything just felt so smooth with this. That soft feeling that I had when using it really helped me grab the ball and have just a ton of control getting it into the kitchen and placing the ball where I wanted it to. Dinks also felt really good. I wouldn't say there's anything special about using this paddle for dinks over other paddles, but it still felt really solid all the way around. But overall for control, I would give this paddle a solid 8.5 out of 10. That is the highest rating I've given for control so far. All right, now really quick, let's talk spin. So spin on this is fine. I'd say there's really nothing special about it, but it's also not bad either, so it's just kind of average or maybe slightly above average. The paddle itself didn't come super gritty initially, and it definitely feels even smoother now after weeks of using it. But that said, you can still get plenty of spin on the ball, so I don't think it's a huge concern. All that said, for spin, I would give this paddle a 6.5 out of 10. All right, now onto the sweet spot. So being that this is a wide body paddle, the sweet spot on this is, as expected, pretty dang good. This is especially useful for when you go for drops because it just helps you get that much more consistency. But it's also just nice for hitting the ball in general. Now, the only downside when using this paddle when it comes to sweet spot is, while the sweet spot is bigger, I think hitting the non-sweet spot parts, specifically the sides of the paddle, has a more of a consequential effect. This is mainly because sometimes what would happen is it would hit the ball closer to the edge and the paddle would turn from the force, and then the ball would go flying in a direction that you really didn't want it to, unless you wanted the ball to go in the net or out of bounds. Either way, the sweet spot on this is really solid, and overall I would give it an 8 out of 10. All right, now let's get into some of the cons of this paddle. To start, like I said, the wide body can bite you in the ass sometimes, but it doesn't really happen too often, so it's not a huge deal. Another big con I noticed was that I whiffed the ball a ton using this paddle, especially on overheads. A lot of the time, I would just nick the top of the paddle when I swung and the ball would go flying out of bounds. Granted, I'm pretty used to an elongated paddle, or at the very least a hybrid shaped paddle, but it did happen to me more than I expected it to. It just takes a bit of time to calibrate that this paddle face isn't quite as long, and if you really can't get past that, then you might want to stick with something like the R3 or maybe just some other elongated paddle. Other than that, I honestly don't have a ton of negative things to say about this. It's honestly been a pretty fun paddle to use the last few weeks. The only other thing is probably the price, since it's a bit spendy at $180, but I do have a discount code where you can get a bit off. Anyways, here's some of my final thoughts on the paddle. So overall, I actually really like the Nova R2. This is probably one of the best control paddles that I've used so far. And again, it's kind of hard to fully explain how soft and plush this feels to play with. So if you like that soft pillow-like feel, then this is definitely worth looking into. But if you like the harder surfaces, then it's probably not. Still, I think this paddle is perfect for control-oriented players who like playing the soft game, because it is just such a solid paddle for that. There were even times I was using a different paddle and felt like my soft game was absolutely trash during the game, which it was. I ended up switching mid-game to this paddle and things seemed to click instantly. Maybe it was placebo, it probably was, but honestly, I think the soft game with this is way easier than most paddles. Also, thanks to its wide body, it's also just great for defensive players who like to be scrappy too. Plus, I forgot to mention that the handle is long enough that you can still play the 2e game with it, though some people may still prefer a bit longer of a handle. All that said, this is a very solid paddle, and I think a lot of people will or would enjoy this. All right, that's it. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider subscribing if any of this was helpful, and I will see you next time.